I'm Emily Ngo. I am co-author of New York Playbook for Politico, and I'm pleased to be joined by Sadiq Khan. He's the mayor of London, elected to a third term earlier this year, making history in that way, but breaking barriers from the jump when you were elected in 2016. You've seen a lot of change in your city, in your country, in the world in those years that you've been in power. I want to start, if you don't mind, with the Labour Party, which is now in power after 14 years of Conservative Party rule. I want your assessment of how the party is doing in power, because from my vantage point, he's had a very, very rough first couple of months. His approval ratings have plummeted. He is dealing with a number of challenges, not limited to Frockgate, in which he accepted from a donor very lavish gifts, including clothing. And then there is the cutting of fuel allowances for pensioners. How would you say the party is doing, and how is the Prime Minister doing?
Many people were asking the question, would Labour ever win again? And so what Keir's done over the course of the last 4 years is quite remarkable in terms of making that party competitive, holding Conservative Prime Ministers to account, first Boris Johnson, then Liz Truss, then Rishi Sunak, winning a historic general election. And I think his speech today was a really important, sober speech, because I think the British public are fed up with politicians over-promising, under-delivering. They're fed up with politicians lying to them. And what Keir Starmer did today was to set out the tough challenges he's inherited. It has been tough, of course it's tough. I mean, running things is tough. But I'd rather Keir Starmer make those tough calls, tough decisions, be straight with the British people now, rather than having, things being covered up and buried away. For the last 14 years, people in Keir Starmer's job, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor in previous governments have, frankly speaking, lied to the British public about how good things were when they weren't really good. And we've seen the consequence in relation to public services, in relation to a lack of wealth creation, in relation to divisions in our country, North versus South, old versus young, Brexit versus Remain, white versus black, and so forth. And that's not a good way to run a country. I understand why there's a frustration, because we waited so long to get a Labour government and expectations are so high. What I don't want, though, and I think would be unwise, is for us to simply play to the audience. What's more important is to play to a plan. And, Keir Starmer, the Chancellor Rachel Reeves, they've got a plan.
The resetting of government, the rebuilding of the foundation, and change being affected by the Labour Party in power sort of comes on the relative heels of a summer of unrest, violence, looting, arson, that, as I understand it, was born of a lie, of misinformation about who a perpetrator was and where they came from. Where is the country now? How is it healing? Is it behind you all?
What happened, as you've alluded to, is some young children in a part of the UK called Southport had a yoga class with a Taylor Swift theme. A man attacked that activity. 3 children perished. 8 other children were seriously injured. 2 adults were seriously injured, a tragedy. And it was hijacked by the far right, by extremists, and they spread a lie that the attack was perpetrated by an asylum seeker of Muslim faith. And it's noteworthy that these algorithms on social media amplified hatred. At no stage in those first few hours, indeed days, was any attempts made by the social media companies to pull down these lies, to correct the misinformation. Across the country, more than 1,000 arrests made, more than 800 people charged with very serious criminal offences. But again, a good example of the difference having a strong, experienced leader can make. So Keir Starmer was quite clear in condemning unequivocally the acts of these rioters, sent a message to the judges and the police that arrests need to be made. There's going to be tough sentences. And rather than, those 10 days of disturbances and riots taking hold of the entire summer, they ended very quickly.
And what of the sentiment behind the demonstrations and the protests, the Islamophobic, anti-immigrant, xenophobic sentiment? It doesn't go away. There have been legal repercussions. There have been people have been charged, and school has begun again, so it's been tamped down. What happens to those feelings that are still out there, pervasive in the country?
Well, it depends what those feelings are. If one has a feeling of hatred against another because of the colour of their skin, or because of the religion they belong to, or because of their ethnic origin, and that leads to them acting in a way that's criminal, action's got to be taken. But if people's concern, which leads them to go in the protests in the first place, is they're concerned about not having decent healthcare, if they're concerned about not having decent housing for their kids, if they're concerned about not having decent schooling for their children, the job of my profession, whether it's British politicians or American ones in our different respective countries, is to address those concerns.
You and I spoke about the unrest and disorder in the UK that was based in sort of a xenophobic kind of sentiment. I see even now, more recently, Trump and J.D. Vance, his running mate, amplifying a thoroughly debunked claim that Haitian migrants eat their pets. Even on the debate stage, this is something that Donald Trump was saying, and it caught fire on social media. I wonder what you see in Donald Trump and his candidacy now. You and he, exchanged words, not kind ones, years ago. It's no secret that you are not a fan of Donald Trump, and you're in a place to speak more openly about him than maybe some of your contemporaries and peers are in government in the UK. Are you concerned about another Donald Trump presidency? Do you see that maybe it's worse?
In this election coming up on November the 5th, what I'd say in a respectful way to Americans is, I don't think you realise that the rest of the world is watching because we've got skin in the game. Although I don't get a vote on November the 5th, the metaphor I use is what happens in America is the metronome for the rest of the country, those who play an instrument. That sets the beat of what happens across the globe. It sets the beat for how other politicians behave in an election campaign. It sets the beat for how, and the rhythm and the speed of how journalists report a campaign, and how people respond to lies and misinformation. And so, everyone's watching across the globe in relation to whether what J.D. Vance and Donald Trump said is fact-checked. Do people realize it's a lie and so forth? And what are the consequences on November the 5th? And I think, we're in New York this week, the week of the United Nations General Assembly. There are many other big things happening this week in New York. I would argue, hopefully objectively, that a United Nations, a NATO, multilateral agreements with the current president is very different to how it was with the previous President Trump. And that's why many of us are watching with keen interest what happens on November the 5th in the USA.
What are you concerned about or fearful about in terms of policy changes, dramatic ones, when it comes to a potential Donald Trump presidency, a return of Trump to the White House?
We've seen previous behavior in relation to Donald Trump. And so the concern many people outside the USA have is what happened between 2016 and 2020. Compare and contrast to what happened before 2016 and what happened after 2020. I'll give you some examples. And the context is the USA is the only superpower in the world. The most important message I'd say to those of your readers is, look, make sure you're registered to vote and make sure you vote, because the election that happens on November the 5th, in my view, is the most important election in my lifetime. And I say this as somebody who's a Brit, who cares very much what happens in the British elections. I'm somebody who stood for election and stand for elections, but your election matters so much, not just to America and Americans, but to the rest of us as well. My politics, I'm a progressive, right? I want the progressive to win, and Kamala Harris is a progressive. Somebody who's the best in somebody else, somebody who shows empathy. Some of her policies, I support. I think it is really important for the US to be engaged in NATO. I think it'd be a really dangerous place if the USA walks away from NATO. She believes in NATO. I think it's really dangerous if the USA doesn't stand up to Putin. She's somebody who stands up to Putin. She talked last week about the importance of not just the hostages being returned, but a ceasefire in Gaza. It's so important for that to happen.